Then later, we'll let you know how to access this file. Okay, so it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to this first Transcontinental Research Seminar organized in the framework of our partnership, the partnership that was established about 1 year ago between the School of Slavonic and East European Studies of University College London and the Slavic-Eurasian Research Center of the University of Hokkaido. And I really hope that this first seminar will inaugurate a series of online research seminars of this kind, and hopefully it will all culminate in a few years in a face-to-face conference with more tangible outputs. I would like to introduce my dear colleague and co-head of this partnership, Dr. Adachi Daisuke, who will be co-moderating this event today with me, but also he has another role today. He will be a discussant of the second paper. Before we get started, I would like just to mention a few things that have already been happening in the framework of our partnership. As most of you know, in March of this year, we had a preliminary online meeting where most of you have, I think, participated. And this was an opportunity for the colleagues in both centers to introduce themselves, to introduce their research interests and talk a little bit about the projects. Then in July of this year, two of my colleagues, Seth Graham and Rachel Morley, participated in the cinema conference organized by Dr. Adachi at the University of Hokkaido. And there have been some other more individual collaborations between our colleagues. And I should say that we would very much like to encourage this less formal individual contacts between colleagues in our centers. And if we can facilitate this, please let us know. We'll be very happy to put you in touch with the right person so you can start developing some common research agendas. Let me remind you, and particularly for the benefit of those who did not attend our initial session, that the whole idea of the partnership came about because we realized how much in common our research centers, in fact, have. Both of our centers are interdisciplinary, and they approach the complex region that we study from a variety of perspectives that includes history, economics, languages, culture, literature, social studies, and political science. Both of our centers offer research grants to international scholars, and both of our centers publish academic journals of international circulations. At SSEES, we publish the Slavonic and East European Review, which publishes articles and review essays in English. And at the University of Hokkaido, our colleagues publish Acta Slavica Japonica, a journal that publishes articles in English and Russian, but I'm afraid not in Latin, despite the title. And I'm just mentioning it so that you keep in mind these additional publication venues for some of your research. Essentially, our centers, as I said, a fundamental approach to the study of the region that is called diversely Eurasia, post-Soviet Union, Russia, Eastern and Central Europe, etc. And this region has been very much in flux in the last decades, not only politically, ideologically, economically, and geographically, but of course also culturally and linguistically. And this is what inspired, in a way, today's meeting, which we decided to call Rethinking Slavic Area Studies from the Opposite Edges of Eurasia. Many experts who study this region have felt lately that our approaches need to be reviewed and updated in view of all these changes. And in fact, now looking at the title of today's seminar, I realized that the word Slavic certainly does not reflect all the complexity and diversity of this region. So probably it is in fact time to start interrogating our methodologies and our vocabularies. And perhaps this seminar will be sort of a meta seminar today, but I think such periodic may be quite healthy and useful. So let me now just say a few words about the format of today's session. First of all, I'm glad to say that both directors of our centers decided to support us and offer their welcome addresses. So in a couple of minutes, I will invite Professor Diane Koenke, Director of SSEES, to address us. And we will play a video from the director of the Slavic-Eurasian Research Center, Professor Akihiro Iwashita. After that, we will go to the first paper by Professor Uyama, and then Professor Adachi will offer his discussant comments. We decided that since time permits, we will have a brief discussion of each paper right after the discussant comments, while our comments and questions are fresh in our memory. So probably we'll do that. Then we'll have a short break, and then after the break, we will go on to the second paper by Professor Zoran Milutinovic. And actually, Professor Adachi will offer comments to his paper. I'm sorry, Wendy Bracewell will be the discussant of the first one, as stated in the program, right? And then at the end, I would like very much to have a more general discussion, perhaps draw some preliminary conclusions, and hopefully also think of some trajectories of future cooperation. So this is pretty much what we're planning to do today. And I think now it's my great pleasure to welcome Diane Koenke and hear her welcome address. Please, Diane.
Yeah, thanks very much, Masha. And I'm delighted to welcome the participants of this first Transcontinental seminar. As Masha said, one of the events to mark the partnership we have. And I want to thank the director of the Slavic-Eurasian Research Center of the University of Hokkaido, Akihiro Iwashita, for his support for this venture, and especially to the two organizers, Daisuke Adachi from SRC and Maria Rubens from SSEES. As Maria said, we have in common that we are the leading Slavonic area studies in our respective countries. And I think we also have in common that with all area studies, we sometimes struggle for recognition alongside the disciplines. And we also suffer, I think, from the tendency to be self-sufficient in our multidisciplinary homes. And we can sometimes be cut off from larger currents, both within our universities and within our national academic cultures. So this collaboration is an attempt to break out of some of these boundaries and to exchange research ideas and experiences with one another. Now, the pandemic first created the necessity to communicate with one another in this remote fashion rather than face-to-face. And the continuing challenge of the climate emergency will also encourage us to avoid costly travel and to engage with one another by Zoom or other platforms. We know how much we lose in this remoteness, the chance to see each other as whole beings in the round, to engage in small talk, to share meals, to embed ourselves in the physical space around us, and to experience the imprinting of that physical space on our own cognitive engagement. And that's something that can never be replaced by a screen. At the same time, virtual meetings allow us to transcend distance, allow us to engage and interact in real time, to at least see the expressions on our faces, the smiles, the frowns, the eye rolls, the shared jokes. And through our collaboration, we want to develop relationships, not just for a day or a weekend, but that will build and grow over the course of our work together. So I'm very proud of our SSEES and SRC colleagues who have volunteered to engage in this way. And I look forward to the continuing growth and development of a shared intellectual agenda. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Diane. I also was thinking yesterday that perhaps had it not been for the pandemic, we would have been sort of looking for funding and thinking how to organize our periodic meetings, and it would have been probably a lot of headache, and probably it's a little bit easier this way. We're still hoping to all get together, and that will be fantastic for a post-COVID event. But I think it's also great that we can see each other's faces without masks and precisely see each other's smiles, and that's the advantage. Okay, thank you very much. Now, Dash, could you please play the video address from Professor Iwashita?
Good evening from Japan. My name is Akiro Iwashita. I'm the director of Slavic-Eurasian Research Center, Hokkaido University, Japan. It is with great pleasure and excitement today that I look forward to our first joint seminar with you, the School of Slavonic and East European Studies at University College London. This seminar has been made possible by the signing of an agreement on research cooperation between us in July 2020. The School of Slavonic and East European Studies is a world-renowned institution with a long and distinguished history of the conducting comprehensive multidisciplinary regional studies. By comparison, our Slavic-Eurasian Research Center, also well known in North Asia and many other countries, is relatively small. Nevertheless, from our corner of Asia Pacific, we have for many years conducted area studies utilizing perspectives from across the humanities and social sciences. Research cooperation between Western and Eastern edge of Eurasia is essential to produce knowledge and innovation of benefit to the global research community. I heartily wish that our cooperation will one and will develop into an intensive joint research program able to generate fresh ways of understanding future of Eurasia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I hope, Daisuke, you will transfer our great gratitude to the director when you see him next. Okay, so now I would like to, to welcome the first presenter, Professor Tomohiko Uyama. And the title of his paper is A Northern Global South or a Global East, Post-Soviet Area Studies in the Age of Neoliberalism and Great Power Competition. But before I give the floor to Professor Uyama, I would like to ask Daisuke, please, to introduce him briefly for the benefit of our extended audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for a very good introduction to our collaboration and this seminar. And thank you, Diane, and thank you, Iwashita Sensei, for very great and fantastic opening remarks. Let me introduce the first speaker of our seminar, Professor Tomohiko Uyama. Professor Uyama is a professor at the Slavic-Eurasian Research Center, Hokkaido University. He specializes in Central Eurasian history and politics. His research interests range from modern Kazakh intellectuals, Russian imperial history, Orientalism, to contemporary authoritarian regime and international politics. He is the editor and author of numerous books, including Comparing Modern Empires, Imperial Rule and Decolonization in the Changing World Order, Sapporo Slavic-Eurasian Research Center, 2018, and Asiatic Russia, Imperial Power in Regional and International Contexts, London, Routledge, 2012. He has recently authored the article named Origins of the Differences in Political Systems of the Central Asian States, Threat Perception in the Perestroika Period, Международная аналитика, 2021 in Russian. He is currently leading a grant group research entitled Comparative Study of the Rise of Authoritarianism and Populism. Professor Uyama is also a member of the Science Council of Japan, a representative organization of Japanese scholars and scientists in all fields of science. Professor Uyama, are you ready?
Yes, fine.
Thank you.
Professor Koenko. Thank you, Maria, Daisuke.
Thank you very much. I think you can share your presentation. As far
Yes.
as I understand, all presenters have the right to share their materials, so hopefully there won't be any problem. Perfect.
Mhm.
We see it.
So, as Daisuke said, I'm a historian and political scientist specializing in Central Asian or Central Eurasian studies. But today, I would like to make a presentation on a larger topic about post-Soviet area studies. Here are main issues I want to discuss during my presentation. First, the position of the post-Soviet space in the world. Second, marginalization of the post-Soviet space. Third, neoliberalization of knowledge production. Fourth, the impact of great power competition and illiberalism on North-South or North-South-Southeast relations and area studies. And finally, what is to be done to form a common and equal post-Soviet area studies community of scholars in and outside the region, and how to make this field of study visible to non-specialists. My presentation will not be strictly structured in this order. One of the motivations why I wanted to make a presentation at this seminar is that I wrote an article for the journal Социологическое обозрение, Russian Sociological Review. The paper is a comment on Narek Sherekbaev and Aminat Chokobayeva's paper, which is a comment on Martin Miller's paper on the Global East. I want to hear your comment, hear your idea about the concept of the Global East. As some of you, or maybe many of you know, a Swiss geographer, Martin Miller, wrote some articles about post-socialism and the Global East. First, he wrote an article, Goodbye Post-Socialism, and he criticized the concept of post-socialism for several reasons. I will not delve into this problem here. I only say that I basically agree with his critiques of post-socialism, but I would not totally say goodbye to post-socialism. And I also think that the concept of post-Soviet is more viable than the concept of post-socialism. And then Martin Miller wrote an article in search of the Global East. And here he wrote that carving up the world into Global North and Global South, as many scholars do, this erases the presence of the Global East, those countries and societies that occupy an interstitial position between North and South. And he argued that we need to adopt a strategic essentialism to recover the Global East for scholarship. And as we may conceive from the order of his authorship of the two articles, he primarily meant post-socialist countries by the global East. But later he included other parts of the world, for example, cities in the Middle East and South Korea into global Easts. And my own position is closer to his new position, but still I think that the relations between post-socialism and the global East worth further discussion because the experience of socialism is, if not the only, one of the important reasons of the sense of difference between the West and the East. And then the journal Russian Sociological Review published a special issue on the question of the global East. And authors such as Irina Drobina, Almira Usmanova, Nuri Shirikbaev, Aminat Chokobaeva, and so on, wrote their critiques on the idea of the global East. And they argued that we need to historicize post-socialism rather than hastily abandoning it, and that the special features of post-socialist countries mainly derive from the power of nationalism and traditionalism, and specifically the authors I commented on, Chokobaeva and Shirikbaev, wrote that it is impossible to band together the former metropole, that is Russia, and peripheries under a common banner of the global East, as Martin Miller proposed. And in my opinion, Miller's concept of the global East is still immature, even taking into consideration a number of publications he wrote later than the first two articles. The globality of the global East is quite vague. He himself emphasizes that in the concept of the global East, not only the East, but the globality is important. But still, while the globality of the global South is evident, that in that discrepancy or the difference between the rich and poor can be observed globally, it is not clear what is the globality of the East. And also, the concept of the global East includes both the territoriality, that is its basis on the post-socialist countries, and also extraterritorial epistemological position, but the relationship between the two is also vague. And most importantly, although this concept was inspired by the idea of the global South, that is an emancipatory project for former colonies, and Miller himself emphasizes the emancipatory character of his concept, it is not clear from what and how the global East has to be emancipated. And moreover, while Miller tries to re-emphasize the importance of the East or post-socialist countries vis-a-vis the Western world, his view contains elements of Western centrism. he writes that the East is gray. That is, many people conceive this region as not conspicuous, not colorful, but he thinks so because the East is not easily knowable in the global centers of media and scholarship. And he clearly means by the global centers, the Western centers of media and scholarship. And he highly appreciates some scholars from the South, Gayatri Spivak, Edward Said, and so on, for the theoretical impulses that their work gave to the North. It turns out that the global visibility of a region is just in the West, and the level of knowledge production by people from the South or East is assessed by their contribution to the North or West. And evidently, Martin Miller is not a person who is especially have a prejudice on the East or the South, but his hidden Western centrism derives from emergent neo-Western centrism in academia. And this is related to neoliberalism or neoliberalization. Under neoliberal policies of academic management, world universities and researchers are ranked by commercial organizations based on numerical scores of publications in journals printed predominantly by Western publishers. And I think many of us are experiencing the change of research environment because of this system of assessment of research activities. And this system has made it clear to everyone that according to Western criteria, most works of researchers and academic institutions in non-Western, especially post-Soviet countries, are assessed as secondary. In the Soviet times, we knew that the scholarship in the Soviet Union was not leading the world, but still it had its own value, and we quite esteemed their works. But now we witness, at least those who are engaged in editing international journals or writing for such journals, are witnessing many cases like the episode written by Elena Cherubina and Miller in the article A Part of the World or Apart from the World. That is a scholar from a fictional post-Soviet state of Moldavia. He's a locally respected scholar with rich experience and hardworking. He sends his article to a famous Western journal, but within 2 days receives a notice that the editors found that it inadequately references the existing state of the art and suffers from errors of logic and generally inappropriate style. And neoliberalization also leads to unstable funding and frequent reorganization of educational and research institutions. And this phenomenon is observable over the world, but it especially leads to serious consequences in many post-Soviet countries and degrades the condition of research. However, the irony is that while post-Soviet educational and research institutions are keen on raising their world rankings, they are not always receptive to Western academic standards. Especially in humanities, scholars well acquainted with up-to-date Western approaches are few, although there are famous or visible post-Soviet scholars who can talk on the language fit to Western newest scholarship, but the number of such people is actually small. And Western educated young scholars often experience difficulties in finding niches in their country's research communities. I think there are two reasons for this phenomenon. First, in many countries, essentialist and nationalist approaches, which actually derive from older Western scholarship, better fit political and social interests. Second, each country has its own hierarchy of scholars, and authoritative scholars and their students are often reluctant to reorient their approaches. And another serious challenge to Western cultural hegemony is recent great power competition, especially the rise of China and Russia's attempts at discrediting the West. And neither conventional theorists of the global South nor Martin Miller have not caught up with the dramatic change in the world order in the 2010s. And on the one hand, in the eyes of people of non-Western countries, Western political, economic, and cultural supremacy is becoming questionable. But this does not mean that the center of world culture moved to some other part of the world. Although China has become an aggressive great power, it is unlikely that China will be soon recognized as a leader of the oppressed global South. And while rapidly developing its technological capability, China is unlikely to become a world leader in most branches of humanities and humanities and social sciences because of the lack of academic freedom. In Japan, people are worried by the fact that in the world university rankings, Japanese universities now occupy lower rankings than Chinese universities. But in our fields of humanities and social sciences, Chinese scholars are far from leading positions. And to think about the post-Soviet space, this space is not only a periphery of the West-centered world system, but also a semi-periphery of the world order that China wants to create. And considering the diversity of non-Western and not advanced countries, we have actually no reason to single out the post-Soviet states from the global South in the economic sense. Miller writes that the East is very different from the global South. But actually, if we look at GDP or other economic indicators, the difference is becoming smaller and smaller. And the post-Soviet countries also deserve joining the emancipatory project of the global South against Western centuries. However, the post-Soviet space is different from many other parts of the South. First, because Russia is a participant in great power competition. And second, although there are other southern participants in great power competition, like China, India, Turkey, and so on, Russia is a former European superpower and still maintains our residual empire. That is, Russia still has many common cultural features with Europe, and also its relations with other post-Soviet states are comparable to relations between former European metropoles with their former colonies. Although Russia's relations with other post-Soviet states vary, relations with Ukraine and relations with Central Asia are very different. And so considering these two factors, the post-Soviet space can be called a northern global south. It has common features still with the north and many common features with the south. And if we think about area studies more broadly, neoliberalization of academia prioritizes disciplines with numerically large research communities. That is, scholars in the field of distinctive disciplines can be receive higher rankings simply because their research communities are larger. So these tendencies can hurt area studies. And another problem is that area studies are originally studies of the other, but after the criticism of Great Orientalism, area studies specialists have tried to form common research communities with scholars of the countries they study. However, as I earlier said, neoliberalism reinforces neo-Western centrism and make it difficult to maintain equal relations with scholars of the countries we study. And also inside the West and Japan, illiberal, xenophobic, and isolationist tendencies are gaining force. And of course, among the area studies specialists, there are various people, including nationalists, but usually area studies scholars tend to closer to the position of multiculturalism, and these more or less liberal and internationalist scholars are experiencing difficulties in making their voice heard in their own society. And this difficulty is added to the task to deal with illiberal, essentialist, and traditionalist values in the post-Soviet countries. So the formation of a common and equal research community between the West and Japan and the post-Soviet space is hindered not only by Western centrism, but also by differences in research trends. For example, in Central Asian studies, gender issues and transnational mobility attract much attention of Western scholars, while mainstream scholars in the region study national history, national culture, governmental policy, and so on. So if you look at topics of articles published in Western leading journals on Central Asia and those in journals published inside the region, they are very, very different. And in order to at least partially resolve this problem, Western and Japanese scholars have to study such issues which are discussed in the region itself with approaches different from local scholars. And it is often very difficult to reach common views, but by writing on same themes, same topics, we can at least have common topics for dialogue. And finally, the 30-year history of the post-Soviet space has shown that despite many differences among the countries, common legacies and dynamics of this space still matter. However, in order to make non-specialists understand the importance of post-Soviet studies, we need not only to study specificities of the region, but also to compare it with other parts of the North and the South, situating it in the context of great power competition. And at the Slavic-Eurasian Research Center, we have conducted a number of comparative research projects based on the idea that we have to show the importance of our region by making comparisons. So such projects include comparative research on major regional powers in Eurasia, which we conducted about 10 years ago. And now we are preparing to launch a new research program on survival and resilience in the changing world. So we will be happy if we can cooperate with UCLCs, not only on Slavic-Eurasian studies themselves, but also on comparative topics. I'm sorry that I cannot present a clear-cut conclusion, but my today's presentation is a sort of think piece rather than completed research. So I will be happy to receive your reactions and inputs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tomohiko, for a very thought-provoking piece. Now I'll be thinking of my home country as part of Northern Global South. That's quite an interesting definition. I'm sure that when grateful, our discussant will offer very illuminating comments on this topic. So let me invite Wendy. She's Professor Emerita at SSEES. Wendy, go ahead.
Thank you, Masha, and thank you, Professor Uyama. I must apologize in these comments. I think I will not directly address what Professor Uyama has said. I only received his presentation on Saturday night. So my comments come from a slightly different place. But I think that what I have to say on listening to Professor Uyama shows some commonalities and maybe also some differences that might provide a starting point for some discussion afterwards. My remarks on the concept and potential use of the Global East come largely from my own experience as a Balkanist at SSEES, and one of the editors of a project of compiling an anti-atlas that attempts to look at area studies and what it might be able to do. We chose to set up this anti-atlas from a position very deliberately and explicitly rooted in the east of Europe, rather than pretending to be a view from nowhere, while actually reflecting Western academia's positions and preoccupations. And in the process of editing this work, I and my colleagues, one of whom I think is here today, Michał Murawski, as well as Tim Beasley-Murray, both of us associated with SSEES. While doing this, we found it extremely useful to reflect on the idea of a global East, or better, global East's variants of the idea of a global East, as a resource for rethinking the ways in which knowledge of the world is produced, circulated, and reproduced. Now, some rethinkings of area studies have begun by inverting the north-south polarity. And I have in mind here works like Raewyn Connell's really fascinating book, Southern Theory, that argues for the importance of social theory coming from societies outside the dominant European North American metropoles. But inverting north and south and putting south as the primary focus tends to replicate some problematic assumptions, in particular the overriding importance of binary divisions. And that shapes the resulting insights. I think one of the most awkward of these is the acceptance of the existence of radical alterities, often answered by celebrating hybridity, which is something that ultimately keeps that sense of radical difference in place. In this view, the South is everywhere, global, in terms of its poverty and its lack of access to resources, but it's always also the other to an often essentialized North. So you get this very clear binary division. We found that thinking in terms of Eastern Europe complicates this paradigm in really helpful ways, not just because the East of Europe is simultaneously North, or to put it in more familiar post-colonial terms, Europe, but it's also other, never fully or unproblematically recognized as European. States in the region have been simultaneously colonized and colonizers, economically backwards, but culturally and politically developed, either doubly peripheral to West and East, or as with Russia, what Vyacheslav Morozov has called a subaltern empire, which sounds like an oxymoron, but is a very useful way of thinking about Russia. So East and West, I think, are not opposed categories, leaving aside Kipling's remark that East is East and West is West. Rather, they're something that are constantly shifting, depending on perspective and trajectory. Go far enough and any East becomes west of something. And hence there's this wonderful self-deprecating North Macedonian joke. Pity the country for which Albania is the West. These complexities prevent the easy application of theories and vocabularies developed elsewhere, and they force engagement with the specificity of local histories, circumstances, and perceptions, and necessitate understanding both in local vernaculars and in languages of cross-cultural communication. This in turn makes it harder to think in terms of easy binaries, and instead focuses attention on complex formulations of sameness and difference, and the strategic uses to which they're put. So for example, nesting ideas of Eastness as a self-defensive mechanism, for example. The concept of the global East expands on these affordances. I'm not sure that it needs to be essentialized, even strategically, or territorialized, fixed to a specific, usually post-socialist or post-Soviet time and place, at least for the purposes of rethinking the production of knowledge. So what area studies does, yeah? as a political project of making allies and grasping for power, if not for emancipation, the stakes and strategies may be different, but I'm not sure that that's something that should be our primary goal as area studies scholars. Instead, I find inspiring the implications of Muller's approach in gesturing to ways of defining the global East or Easts as something in between, with less focus on binary relations of wealth, poverty, domination, subordination, and so on. This in-betweenness can be grasped through specific material conditions and relationships. So I think semi-periphery is still a useful concept for some purposes. But world system theory, which this term comes from, has its disadvantages and blind spots as well. The global East can play the role of an intellectual or political vanguard, for example, while nonetheless remaining in a semi-peripheral position economically. So the global East in our anti-atlas is not primarily a project of definition and location, but of tool building and analysis. The question isn't where is it, but what is it useful for? This approach to tool building is what justifies the concept of the global East, and what also ought to make it visible more widely, including in Western academia, but not only there. I see the potential as fourfold. I'm just going to go through my list of ways in which this might help us think differently. First of all, as a means of testing theories or concepts that are generated elsewhere and identifying false universals, or concepts that are advanced as a general norm, but in fact are heavily context dependent. The paradigmatic example, I think, comes from work on the Global South. Those people who questioned the monolithic character of modernization and countered with the current discussion of alternative modernities. I think we could see similar benefits from an assessment of experiences of decolonization, or maybe better, de-Westernization in Russia, in China, in Brazil, and in India, all rather different experiences depending on the historical context, as well as depending on present politics, and comparing those would be useful. That takes me to my second point about the usefulness of the global East as a source of fruitful comparison that might revise taken for granted assumptions, looking at, for example, tech innovation, not just in Silicon Valley and in China, but maybe also in Cluj in Romania, with its very different but also vibrant digital ecosystem based on socialist era investment in computer production and cybernetics, but caught up in a world system of politics and economics that gives it a very specific sort of place. Or maybe to take a different example, looking at self-perceptions of one's culture and society as inauthentic and imitative, particularly in comparison to Western models. And here I have in mind places in which this sense of imitation and inauthenticity has been already theorized. This is something that we're very familiar with in East European work, and I can think of particularly good work in Romania on the idea of Romanian inauthenticity as being a matter of privileging form over function. But we might compare that to what has gone on in Brazil, particularly with the theorizing of Roberto Schwartz, who talks about this as a specifically Brazilian thing, seeing yourself as somehow not right, just going through the motions. Or coming from my own cultural background, the Australian notion of the cultural cringe, always as being something second-rate and derivative in comparison to what Australians used to call home, the UK, without ever having actually been there. Okay, my third point, beyond theory testing and comparison, is using the global East as a framework for examining exchanges and entanglements, particularly ones that don't necessarily pass through or be validated by Western or Northern metropoles. What frictions or affordances characterize East-South exchanges, for example? Here I have in mind stuff like Sudho Rajagopalan's work on the alternative cosmopolitanisms traced by the circulation of Soviet products in Cuba and in India. She's written some wonderful stuff about this. Well, I won't go through and do a list, but I will mention something that I'm currently interested in and working on. I'm extremely curious about the Yugoslav-Japanese entanglement embodied in the Yugoslav or now Croatian soup powder, vegeta, laced with MSG and dried vegetables, which is both acknowledged in the packaging of this stuff with its fake Japanese typeface, but otherwise completely ignored, even as vegeta becomes a global product. So doing this sort of work on exchange and entanglement might give us a view of globalization as something other than transition to Western models. And this then takes me to my fourth point, the Global East as a basis for theorizing. The Global East is not necessarily a deviation from norms that are necessarily set in the West. Sometimes I think it would be better to think of it in terms of vanguard and ask what that vanguardism is all about. And here my example is the recent populist and illiberal turn in Western politics, which, if we think about it carefully, is preceded by the same moves in the East. What insights would be gained by starting with Hungary and Poland and thinking about illiberalism rather than by starting with Trump and Boris Johnson? The ultimate goal of our anti-atlas, as well as of area study, I think is this: a better understanding of our messy and complex world, of what it means to be human in particular circumstances and times and places, a better understanding of how things work or don't work, all without reducing this knowledge to what is important or recognizable to any one hegemonic point of view, whether this is Western academia or any other. A relational, provisional, heuristic notion of a global East or multiple in-between Easts seems to me to be a useful way of working towards this. And I'll stop there and hope that this has provoked some reaction from you.
Thank you very much, Wendy. So I think we should take maybe about 10 minutes, a little bit more, for discussion of this specific paper and Wendy's very thoughtful, insightful comments that add to the complexity of the topic, of course. I think after that we'll take a break, but for now, at least we are still very well aware of what is being said, and I'm sure that we can start the discussion right now. I just want to draw your attention to a couple of comments that Alona put in the chat. And in fact, Alona, if you would like to say something, it would be welcome at this point. If not, that's fine. We can always be checking the chat and the comments there. So please, let's do it informally. You know, I don't see everyone on my screen. I don't see any sign for raised hands. So I just invite colleagues to unmute themselves and speak if they have a question or comment, please. Or we can engage, of course, with the questions in the chat. I think it would be still more productive to maybe say them to everybody, right? Alexander, for instance, if you would like to. Yes, and Alona.
Masha, I don't know if my connection could make me audible.
We hear you well, that's fine.
Yes, if you do, I'd like to make a comment if that's all right. I put some of the first reactions in the chat, and I cannot, support the speaker more in his perception of the academia in our part of the world. I increasingly receive requests for co-authorship in order to be able to place their work in the Western journals. And that sort of originally puzzled me because obviously there are President Putin's driven initiatives to get Russian universities, for example, into the top 100 in the world. And the managers are putting under the pressure to actually, see how the ratings are made. So they are trying to inscribe themselves in the Western-centric matrix. And the way they do it, kind of speedy way, is to see if they could rely on the alumni that or compatriots who are no longer in Russia but work elsewhere, try to create some kind of collectives that would publish in top journals that would increase the ratings of the home universities. So I am on the board of the international academic board for the Novosibirsk University, for example, and that's exactly the kind of issues that are discussed, that sort of secondary nature of intellectual enterprise that really goes contrary to their understanding of themselves as the fundamental university of a fundamental science. And that is, in a way, is probably best expressed for me by Professor James Robinson, who is an economist and a historian from the University of Chicago, who said that, the economics and politics historically as disciplines have emerged in the West and therefore carry a lot of assumptions, taken for granted discourse that has been spread around the world, and it's only too logical. On the other hand, what we have is that, and he puts himself in a position of, advising to the Middle East and other parts of the world, and he says that the Western theory has to do a lot of unlearning in the sense that we have to question centrality of the state. We have to question almost everything, not only the notions of modernization, the tradition, a lot of things that our disciplinary knowledge relies on. And that's where we, so-called area studies without borders, seem to fit very well, because we are in possession of expertise that the disciplines do not have. The trouble is that the crossovers in academia are becoming intrinsically difficult, and that's what I tried to overcome in a very sort of bottom-up, sort of modest way, by reaching out from the informality studies in Russia to all over the globe, just to check it out, just to see if practices of survival and resilience are not necessarily specifically Russian, but actually replicated in a very similar human and humane informal problem solving elsewhere in the world. So that's why I'm very enthusiastic to hear that there is an initiative of a project on resilience and survival, and I'm very happy to help if necessary. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Alona. Certainly, that's something we should keep in mind and continue this conversation after our seminar is over. I just listening to to both of you, I was thinking of what I hear at the Higher School of Economics, for example, and I periodically give lectures now in both the St. Petersburg branch and in Moscow. And believe it or not, for a number of years already, the full staff members of the Higher School of Economics receive addition to their salary if they publish an article in one of the Western journals that enter into the Scopus ranking.
Yes.
in Russia, several journals in my field also have this ranking because you can apply and receive it. But somehow when they publish in the Russian Scopus journal, they don't get any monetary compensation. But if they publish, for example, one of my colleagues published in SEER, in the Slavonic and East European Review, and he's still telling me how wonderful it is that for several years already he has this extra amount in his monthly salary, which tells you something about Western models and the kind of self-imposed criteria that Russian universities are operating under. Okay, that was just a comment. There is also a very interesting and conceptual question from Alexander Rankovich in the chat, and I wonder if maybe Alexander would like to talk to us about it and maybe formulate it for everyone's benefit, or if everyone can already see it, maybe somebody will respond, or Hiko, maybe Wendy or somebody else.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm sorry I can't turn on my camera because of a very fragile internet connection. I guess this is the disadvantage of the cyberspace. I was just wondering, since we were talking about the global South, and I was immediately thinking about post-colonial theory, obviously, because it was, I think, somehow a useful concept for postcolonial theory. So I was wondering, how can we locate actually this diversity of then colonial and decolonial practices? And I guess this question goes both to Professor Yama and Professor Bracewell in that sense, since, okay, Russia was an imperial power, but most countries in Europe's East have not been colonial powers, and some were engaged in the non-aligned movement, Yugoslavia and so on. So how does perhaps post-colonial thought and practice fit into this category of the global East? Thank you.
Yes, Tomohiko, would you like to maybe start answering, and then maybe we'll go to Wendy? You have something?
Well, first, I want to thank everyone for great comments and questions. And I see many of you also have common experiences in working with scholars from Russia and other post-Soviet countries and share concerns. Alexander's question, I think, is also related to the concept of binary raised by Wendy. So on one hand, we have to always try to overcome the binary framework in order to conceive diversity and subtle difference between something. And on the other hand, we have to take into consideration that generally people tend to think in a binary framework. So in Russia, many people talk about the difference between them and the West, the Zapad, and in Japan, traditionally, people tend to compare themselves with the West and also other parts of the East. So when we talk about global East or other geographical concepts, we always have to evade essentialization of such concepts. But also, we have to think about stereotypical thinking of people themselves. And concerning imperial power, imperial relations, I think imperial Eurasians exist in many parts of the world, and this is not the specificity of only the post-Soviet space, but the post-Soviet space is at the same time a microcosm of the world order, because Russia itself is not a super rich country and can be regarded even as a part of the global south. But as Wendy mentioned, it is a subaltern empire. So the post-Soviet space includes it has relations similar to Western power and former colonies. So we have to always think about how the world or the post-Soviet space can be constructed in a different logics, in various logics. So far my answer is yes. Here is my answer.
Shall I follow on from that? I think
Yes.
different logics is a really helpful way of thinking about an answer to Alexander Rankovich's question, which is a terrific question. You know, what do we do with the notion of colonialism, imperialism, and post-colonial decolonization and post-colonial thought and practice? The Global East seems to me to be a really useful place to rethink some of this, and to rethink some of maybe the fairly simplistic ways of presenting colonialism and post-colonialism in terms of the West and the rest, or even more irritatingly, Europe and non-Europe. If we think about it from the perspective of Eastern Europe, it makes it much more complicated, as his question has pointed out. And the discussion around those complications, I think, has already been extremely useful in pressing us to think about things like cultural colonialism, when it is not a matter of political power exerted over an area, but of intellectual power. In fact, that's what we've been talking about during these comments quite a lot. Or the concept that Michael Herzfeld, the anthropologist of Greek, put forward of crypto-colonialism, which looked as though it was all about universal education, but was actually about acculturating, in his case, Greeks to Western European educational standards. So I think that in this particular case, the notion of a third space, an interstitial space, a space where the logics of difference work in a slightly different way, it's extremely helpful for revising the theory. I think this is a place where it bears out the value of thinking from the East.
Yes, thank you, Wendy. Would somebody like to add something, to propose another question or comment, please? Yes. I don't think I see anyone's hands. And if anyone wants to say something at this point, I invite you to just unmute yourselves and say it.
Hi, sorry, I'm having difficulty finding all the right buttons because I'm on the move and on my phone. But But I just wanted to ask to sort of continue the thread of what Wendy and Alyona and others have been saying in everyone in their excellent contributions with regards to the concept of post-socialism or other alternative kind of mutations of this concept that have emerged, like zombie socialism and trans socialism and still socialism and other such ideas. I wonder whether people think that it's useful or interesting to export the category of post-socialism to countries where state socialism actually did not happen. So can we think about a post-socialist Mumbai or a post-socialist Hokkaido or a post-socialist Mozambique? I can think, I mean, in certain contexts, it makes more sense than in others. In Mozambique or Angola, it might make more sense than in Mumbai or in Hokkaido. But I mean, I wonder whether this category actually has some potential to be exported beyond the boundaries of the kind of Soviet-led bloc. So that's my question. I don't know if there's enough time to discuss it.
Oh, absolutely, we have time. Yes, please. Who would like to take this?
I think we should make Michał discuss it.
I mean, I'd be happy to try. I'm just all over. I'm kind of in changing buses, but I can see what I can do. I mean, I have in a couple of our texts in the Atlas, I think this is suggested. And in another book that I edited, the Recentering the City book, for example, there's an article about post-socialist Mumbai, and this is a concept that has been suggested before by people like Zsuzsa Gila in her text on the global post-socialist condition from 2009, I think it is. Douglas Rogers kinds of hints at this idea in his text on unbinding theory from the East, that in a sense the move away from state socialist economic management and political control is a kind of royal road for making sense of the transformations of the broader world from the 90s onwards. And that in a way, perhaps it's a bit of a metaphor, or it's a bit of a poetic device, which isn't intended to be absolute in its applicability to everywhere, or kind of in some sort of imperial attempt to subsume the entire world into Moscow's shadow. But it's an attempt to use a category that was developed for a particular part of the world for other parts of the world, given that we do understand, we apply Foucault's idea of the panopticon or Agamben or Deleuze and Guattari to places that are unrelated to the empirical places from which Agamben or Foucault were writing. Why can't we also take a concept that is used to make sense of a particular part of the world and apply it beyond that? So if this move has been made from the West to the East, then why can't we also try to make it from the East to the West, even if it's a category error? Because sometimes perhaps category errors can have interesting outcomes. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I wonder if anybody does have anything to say about that. And there was a fragment about post-socialism, but my connection cut out for about half of the first paper, so I didn't quite catch what it was. Wendy, do you think this is something that's useful or interesting? Because I know we've kind of touched upon this in some of our conversations.
I do. I was nodding my head vigorously while you were speaking, and I think I would like to play with it. Maybe not in terms of post-socialism, but in terms of theory or concepts grounded in a particular part of the world and then projected elsewhere. Let me propose a parallel or an analog, which is balkanization. You know, something that came out of small states at odds with one another, but which now seems to be projected onto everything, you know, any state of conflict and fragmentation throughout the world. So we've seen that process of working from one direction to a global set of concepts before. I don't see why it couldn't work with post-socialism. The point is, what do we want to do with it? And I think you were quite helpful in identifying some of the aspects that we might look at under the heading of that metaphor, and a poetic sense of what words can do, what associations they can set off, I think is quite useful for us. We shouldn't reject them.
I was actually thinking about this in order to give a more concrete example this morning. As I woke up in my bedroom, I live on a council estate in North London, where in a very unusual way, the heating is turned on by the council in October and switched off in March. And there's nothing you can do about it. However, the heating is in the wall, and neighbors on one side of the wall have access to valves that can pump the heating up and down in certain rooms. So, for example, the neighbors next door had pumped the heating up to about 40 degrees, seemingly, in the bedroom downstairs, and I woke up in a kind of overheated sauna, which is reminiscent in a way of the way that heating is organized was in my childhood in Poland, and still is in Russia, and still is in China. The government decides whether you're hot and cold, and some neighbors have access to kind of secondary control units which can modify this. So in a sense, there's a kind of island of post-socialist heating practices in North London, which exists in a sea of neoliberal radiator valves. Mm-hmm. So here's one concrete example, but I'm not sure if that's enough for a grand theory.
I think, Tomohiko, I think you wanted to say something, right? Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much for a very interesting idea. I need more time to well understand Mihal's idea, but it provoked me to think about another possibility of using the concept of post-socialism, because not only in the post-socialist countries, but we all live in a world where socialism, or at least state socialism, stopped to being an influential ideology. And at least in Japan, during the Cold War period, socialism had quite much influence, and it influenced oppositional movements. It influenced some governmental policies, but now the government has no serious ideological challenger, and sometimes even liberalism is discredited because of its seeming similarity with socialism. So I think the demise of state socialism has indeed a global impact, even on today's our life.
Thank you very much. I think what we'll do now, I see that Ruikai would like to ask a question, and let it be the last one for this part of our talk. Then we'll make a break, and then hopefully we'll have still time at the end to continue. Okay, please go ahead, Ruikai.
Okay. Can you listen? Hear me? Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for your fantastic opinions, and konnichiwa and hello. I have a small questions and listen a lot. That Professor Uyama proposed a very excellent idea. I think it's that he equals the post-Soviet space with the global East, and I think a lot that maybe in the traditional Oriental idea that the Oriental countries included the post-Soviet space and China. So how to identify the global East with the orientation, the concept of the orientation, because I think that many post-Soviet some post-Soviet states, such as ballistic countries such as Estonia and Estonia, plays a role between the East and the West. Account is specifically to identify that it belongs to the global East, and I think that in the idea of the Russians foreign policy, that the Russian has an idea that the Eurasian, that he gives the integration between the post-Soviet space and the Russian. So if we separate the post-Soviet space with the global East, so I think we maybe cut the Eurasian between the Europe and the global East. So how to identify the global East from the perspective of the geopolitics? Thank you very much. Okay.
Well, thank you, Rikai, for an interesting and big question. Well, it's difficult to answer in a short time, but again, here emerges the difficulty in dealing with the idea of global East simply as a parallel to global South, because as I said, Russia is a subject of geopolitical game. So, and in that sense, Russia has a common feature of China and other great powers challenging the existing world order. So again, I want to emphasize that global East or Northern global South has an element of, has a feature of residual empire, and without thinking about great power competition from the perspective of longer imperial history or history of imperialism, we cannot understand the nature of the so-called global East. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, dear colleagues, I invite you to take maybe a 5-minute break. I hope it will be enough to grab some tea, coffee, perhaps sake or a bottle of supper, a beer, because in Japan, time is very appropriate for an aperitif, and it may loosen some of our tongues down the road. So it's now 20 minutes to 11. So let's reconvene at 11:15 so we can proceed in a timely fashion, okay? Well, I assume everyone is back. Yes. Zoran is here. Daisuke is here. Diane is here. Okay. And Wendy. Okay, I think that we can probably start the second part of our seminar. And we're shifting gears a little bit. We are switching from a more history, politics-oriented perspective to culture, linguistics, but of course, as always, culture is saturated by politics. So in the second half of our session today, we'll hear the presentation by Professor Zoran Milutinovic. The title of his paper is Language and Literature in Area Studies, How to Understand Other Cultures Through Literature. And before I invite Zoran to start his talk, I'd like to just say a few words about him. His official title is Professor of South Slav Literature and Modern Literary Theory. Zoran's research interests are very broad. He studies Serbian culture and theater, the concept of common Yugoslav culture, the writings of Ivo Andrić, and obviously different aspects of modern literary and cultural theory. Zoran has authored a number of books, monographs, and edited volumes, including Ivo Andrić and Bosnian Nationalism, Getting Over Europe, the Construction of Europe in Serbian Culture, What is the West? Nationalism, Cosmopolitanism, and the West in Early 20th Century Serbian Culture, and many others. And he publishes in Serbian and English. Among his recent edited volumes, I would like to point out specifically the book that came out last year and is entitled The Rebirth of Area Studies. I think this title is extremely relevant for our discussion today. In part, even the topic of our seminar was inspired by this publication, in which a number of the SSEES colleagues participated, including Wendy. And I hope that Zoran today will make some references to this volume. So please, Zoran, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Masha, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity to address this audience. Before I embarrass myself terribly, can you help me with mounting my presentation? Do I just share screen, or is there another trick which I'm not aware of? Masha, I can't hear you. If you can unmute.
Yes, sorry. As I understand from Barbora's instructions, and if Dash is here, she can correct me if I'm wrong, you can just share the screen. All participants should be able to just share the screen. So try doing that, and hopefully it will work.
Right.
Up at the bottom there. If worst comes to worst, perhaps, and if Dash is no longer, Dash, are you with us?
I'm here, Maria. Zoran. Oh, yep, you got it.
Did I?
We see it.
We can see your screen.
I can't.
Oh, you can't see the screen yourself?
No. I can't see the presentation is here. It's been hiding. Okay, maybe there is also a trick which makes it full screen.
Yeah, slideshow. Can you press on it? Slideshow, and then from beginning, from the first slide. Play from start. Yeah, that's it.
Fantastic. This is not as difficult as I expected it to be. Okay. I propose to try to answer in this talk the following question. What are we actually doing when we, as area study scholars, try to understand other cultures through their literatures? Is this at all possible? And if yes, how? I will begin by showing how the concept of reflection survives in contemporary literary and cultural theory, such as in the shape of Frederick Jameson's National Allegory, or Pascal Casanova's minor or combative literature. And then I will try to demonstrate that Hans-Georg Gadamer's theory of language offers a more fruitful viewpoint, namely that literature, the language art, provides access to another culture by introducing us to tacit background understandings stored in language. My talk is based on some ideas I put forward in parts of the collection The Rebirth of Area Studies, published in 2020, which Masha has already mentioned. Now, the question of the possibility of understanding other cultures through their literatures is rarely asked explicitly, yet a positive answer to it forms the basis of everything we do in teaching as well as in research. It is assumed that it is possible, and the question more often takes the form one finds in Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak's Death of a Discipline, a book which advocates a fusion of literary and area studies. She says, how can I, as a reader of literature, supplement the social sciences? This is a difficult question to answer, not least because the tradition of thinking about literature offers contradictory views, and because other disciplines have their own take on the benefits of knowing something about national literatures. The easiest answer is the least satisfactory. Nations have their cultures, of which literature is not just a part, but the very center, just as they have rivers and mountains, religions, histories, and institutions. Knowledge of a nation cannot be complete without knowing what those who belong to it have thought, written, or read. At times, the usefulness of literature is emphasized somewhat more. For instance, Thomas Piketty praises Balzac and Jane Austen for their insights into economic processes. Historical novels sometimes offer popular interpretations of a nation's history, but no historian would base their research on them. Historical novels are more significant for studying popular interpretations of history, which tend to guide people in their choices, decisions, and allegiances more than academic historiography ever will. The core of the problem, however, is that literary works of art rarely, if ever, reflect the reality of historical, political, and economic processes. Even if they claim to do so, they're always works of fiction and of imagination, which are not bound by any laws of accurate representation. Moreover, only a small fraction of literature even pretends to do so. Yet, most of us feel compelled by habit, by tradition and expectations, even by institutional requirements and curriculum designs, compelled to follow the well-trodden path which sees another culture reflected in its literature, even though we would oppose the very idea of reflection, deeming it theoretically indefensible. The debate on representation or reference or mimesis, which from the very beginning had been one of the central topics of literary theory. Plato's Republic and Aristotle's Poetics, for instance, which are literary theory's founding texts, initiated the long discussion about the relationship between literature on one hand and history and reality on the other. Closer to our time, and in the century which witnessed the proliferation of different theoretical approaches to literature, two major directions crystallized. The conventionalists or formalists, who claim that any reference to reality is only an illusion, a result of semiosis or a product of literary conventions. If novels and stories ever refer to anything, they would say it is not to reality, but to other novels and stories. The opposite camp, contextualists of various persuasions, believe that every text has its own context, which may be purely literary, as the conventionalists insist, but may also be extra-literary, namely historical, social, cultural, and political. This context can be the dominant ideology of a specific time and space, as various Marxist schools of thought claimed, disagreeing about the content of this concept all along. Or it can be structures of feeling, a concept created by Raymond Williams in order to refer to a set of perceptions, values, and norms characteristic of a group of people in a specific historical period, which are best materialized in art forms. Or it could be the poetics of culture, as New Historicism maintains, understood as a network of various discourses which circulate in a society and which become sedimented in literary texts. Yet, one rarely comes across studies which offer sophisticated analysis of ideology, of structures of feeling, or of poetics of culture. What fills our academic journals is treating literature as a national allegory. The creator of this label was Frederick Jameson, who claimed that all texts written in the third world being everything that is not the West. So all of them are necessarily allegorical, and in a very specific way, they are to be read as national allegories, says Jameson. The first world has undergone the radical split between the poetic and the political, or the private and the public, claimed Jameson. And its literature has become the preserve of the former. Third world texts, claims Jameson, I'm quoting, even those which are seemingly private and invested with a properly libidinal dynamic, necessarily project a political dimension in the form of national allegory. The story of the private individual destiny is always an allegory of the embattled situation of the public third world culture and society. The end of quote. In his criticism of this thesis, Ijaz Ahmad, an Indian literary theorist and poet, wrote the following: I was born in India and I write poetry in Urdu, a language not commonly understood among US intellectuals. So I said to myself, all necessarily, it felt odd, the end of quote. So Western literature is all and necessarily about the poetic and private, while the rest, also all and necessarily, always write only about the public and the political, about their embattled nations, regardless of what the actual text may be about. No love poetry for the third world then. However, Jameson is certainly right in one respect. This really is how non-Western literature is very often read and interpreted in Western academia. And if a particular poem, play, or novel cannot be easily interpreted as a national allegory, it is deemed to be of no interest for studying a culture to which it belongs. Writers from non-Western cultures are painfully aware of this. Romanian author Mircea Cartarescu sums up the message he gets from the publishers, critics, and academics in the following manner. I'm quoting, "Stay where you are, stay in your own ghetto, describe your tiny chunk of the Southeast European history, write about Securitate, about your Ceausescu, about your people's house, about your dogs, your homeless children, your gypsies. Be proud of your dissidents during the communist days. Leave it to us to write about love, death, happiness, agony, and ecstasy. Leave it to us to create the avant-garde, to innovate, to breed cultural normality. Your only chance here is to describe your small exotic world for some small publishing house that might accept you. Just choose. Either you conform to our cliches or you disappear." The end of quote. The results of such interpretations are quite understandably of little value if one approaches all third world texts with the assumption that they are necessarily about embattled nations. One will find in them only what one has put there oneself. Third world texts will be able only to reflect back to us our own assumptions and projections. And what they may really be saying about people's lives, experiences, histories, hopes, and dreams will remain unknown. Jameson's thesis was heavily criticized left and right, so much so that you wouldn't expect to encounter it ever again. Yet it was repeated by Pascal Casanova in her book, The World Republic of Letters, where she explicitly upholds the idea that the subjective is the domain reserved for literature in large countries, while politicization and the collective are for the rest. This is the premise Casanova advocates in The World Republic of Letters, and even more so in her later article, Combative Literatures, in which her usual differentiation between small and great literatures was changed into combative literatures and pacified or non-engaged ones. The small are combative and devoted to confirming their nation's existence, to national history and honor. The great are disarmed and pacified and devoted to the sphere of the individual, subjective, and non-political. What comes across as a journalistic stereotype not only determines the place of literature in the eyes of socialist scientists and educational managers, but also finds its place in the works of most sophisticated contemporary theory. As Casanova does not offer any examples, it is difficult to tell which national literature she has in mind exactly. But the general guiding principle of classification, that the combative ones are all and always only about national definition, history, and honor, engaged in political and literary struggles for recognition, while in the pacified ones, this is not the dominant ideological outlook, although they too preserve the link with the national space, seems to be devised to help us classify only European literatures in the early 19th century. Do combative literatures still exist in the 21st century? Those of us who study smaller European literatures know that even the newest and the smallest of them have moved, developed, diversified, and disengaged, although they can still be said to be small. Assuming that they have remained forever enchanted by their nations in the making is simply wrong. Serbian writer Danilo Kiš couldn't suppress his annoyance with this stereotype. In his ironical article, Homo Poeticus Regardless, he derided Western expectations that every East European author must be Homo Politicus, while every author from the western part of the continent is allowed to be Homo Poeticus. I'm quoting, Europe sees us, the writers from the other Europe, as people who should always be involved in politics and write only about politics. They, the Americans, the Europeans, etc., have the right to make use of all themes, including love, while they reserve only political questions for us. The end of quote. East European writers are expected to witness the horrors of totalitarianism, to be politically engaged, and to oppose their political regimes. We civilized Europeans, writes Kiš, impersonating a Western author in his essay Homo Poeticus Regardless. So we civilized Europeans, pure in heart and mind, will describe the beauty of our sunsets and our childhoods. We'll write poems about love and whatnot. Why don't you stick to your politico-exotico-komunichetsky problems and leave the real literature, the maid of all work, the sweet servant of our childhood, to us. If they start writing about what we write about, poetry, suffering, history, mythology, the human condition, the time-worn trinkles of plangent vanity, we won't be interested. So Homo politicus is for us, Yugoslavs, while they have the rest. That is, every other facet of that wonderful, multifaceted crystal, the crystal known as Homo poeticus, the poetic animal that suffers from love as well as mortality, from metaphysics as well as politics. No, literature and poetry are equally for us and you, our barbaric dreams and yours, our myths and yours, our loves and yours, our memories and yours, our day-to-day existence and yours, our unhappy childhood and yours, which may just have been unhappy too, our obsession with death and yours, identical, I hope. The end of quote. Despite Cartarescu's and Kishi's protestations, this view of the utility of literature in learning about other cultures survives and blossoms, not only as an unspoken, common sense assumption guiding teaching and research, but as a distinct theoretical stance. However, quietly and unassumingly, one branch of phenomenology has assigned literature a role much more important than just reflecting, recording, and allegorizing. It maintains that whatever else stories may achieve, they also create a meaningful society and make possible an ethical sharing of the common world, as opposed to the merely common physical environment. Telling a story is a communicative act through which a society establishes what it means to be human, to be a saint or a hero, to be honorable or happy, or to live with others. And this act constructs tacit background understandings, which to all members of a society seem natural and universal. Or to put it differently, individuals become members of a particular society if they share the same tacit background understandings. These are preserved in and communicated by society's stories, which point to them or present them to us, usually without precise and explicit definitions. Inspired by Heidegger's reinterpretation of the notion of the world, so not the totality of entities, but the web of meanings which construct our self-understanding and the understanding of everything else around us, phenomenology sees cultures as the totality of significance which we share with one another. The world is always the one that I share with others, as one of Heidegger's most memorable theses goes. Cultures prescribe normative patterns of interpretation and conduct through their languages. Different worlds can be intersubjectively shared only if they are articulated in languages, which bear and transmit tacit pre-understandings of something or other. We share a meaningful world because it has already been previously linguistically articulated. We get to know it not through an innocent and fresh perception, but through becoming accustomed to the ways everything in the world has been previously understood and interpreted. Language records and stores those pre-understandings in its most developed forms, in speech genres such as the paradigmatic story, the habitual everyday expression and the proverb, the literary genres such as myth, epic, history, folk tale, romance, confession, prayer, chronicle, essay, novel, poem, play, and newspaper article, etc. These genres not only offer an unrivaled opportunity to examine the worlds, the webs of meanings sedimented in languages, but also make it possible to see how those worlds came into being through contradictions, paradoxes, ambiguities, and uncertainties, and develop through processes of narration and symbolization in such a manner that the level of conceptualization is never achieved, and yet a specific world still emerges. Understanding a particular world, a historical one, such as the medieval world, or a synchronic one, such as the Russian world, is only possible if one is familiar with the background understandings this world's languages create, stores and communicates to its speakers, and thus binds them into a society. They become members of the same collectivity if they share those meanings, and strangers and foreigners if they do not. Hence, the language genres we are accustomed to calling literature are not studied in the context of area studies only because cultures have literatures as they have rivers and mountains. Rivers and mountains become a particular national and cultural area distinguishable from another when alongside them a specific tradition of storytelling takes root. Traditio, or handing down, passing on to a new generation a set of intersubjectively shared webs of meaning, created in and by the language genres listed above, is what can also be seen as a definition of a national culture. The study of literature is the study of those speech and literary genres. It is not only about intersubjective articulation of a world through language, as it approaches those language genres from many different perspectives, but it does also include that. There is no other humanities discipline which has developed such sophisticated tools for the close reading of cultural texts, spoken and written in the original language, as the study of literature. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Zoran. So I would like to invite Daisuke now to comment on this paper, and then we'll discuss it together.
Thank you for having me, Maria, and Zoran, if I may. Thank you for your very insightful and thought-provoking presentation. I would like to share my text, but I can't.
Maybe if Zoran stops sharing his, you'll be...
Zoran is desperately trying to find the button. Yes, is this? Stop sharing.
Stop sharing.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, I had no time to prepare a beautiful PowerPoint slides such as Zoran's. So I will read my word text. I hope you will forgive me. So I will start my comments. In preparation for my comments, I have read Zoran's text entitled Comparative Area Studies Without Comparisons. What can area studies learn from comparative literature? A book chapter from the Rebirth of Area Studies, Challenges for History, Politics, and International Relations in the 21st Century, as already Maria and Zoran have mentioned, edited by himself and published last year. In this brilliant text, Zoran makes an unexpected analogy between area studies and comparative literature. Quote, similarly to area studies, comparative literature has also been reproached for lacking a clearly defined object and its own method. Comparative literature as a discipline is always in crisis, yet perpetually reconstituting its object and reinventing its methods, end quote. However, as Zoran emphasizes, this is by no means a weakness of comparative literature. Rather, its most important contribution to area studies, helping the latter overcome two methodological shortcomings. That is, a quest for essences and an obsession with purity. Quote, area studies should not become a sum total of area knowledges, but a meta-discipline which inspires disciplinary efforts, a field of theoretical innovation and experimentation in which new questions are asked, conceptual vocabularies proposed, and new perspectives tested, end quote. Following many decades of being in a permanent crisis, constantly seeking subversion of itself, looking for a proper object, and being in a perpetual state of methodological uncertainty, Zoran concludes, quote, comparative literature can help area studies by offering itself as an example of a discipline that is always in crisis, in tension with its component disciplines, and without a readily available object of method, end quote. Zoran's redefinition of area studies as never-ending research process is very suggestive and actual for us, the Slavic-Eurasian Research Center, not only theoretically, but also in a practical sense, as we are planning a comprehensive study entitled Survival Strategies in Slavic-Eurasian Region, as Professor Uyama has already mentioned, in which all of the researchers in our center participate, covering diverse research fields such as international relationships, politics and history, literature, and linguistics. Sorry. In today's talk, as far as I understand, Zoran has shifted his emphasis from the negative definition of comparative literature. That is, comparative literature is neither A nor B, to the more positive one, presenting Hans-Georg Gadamer's theory of as a fruitful viewpoint to understand other cultures through their literatures, which presents very interesting and important problems. Regarding these problems, I have three questions. Zoran's opposition to the view of literature as just reflecting, recording, or allegorizing with a reference to non-Western East European writers such as Kartalevsk and Kishu is very strong and persuasive. However, from historical perspective, the reflection theory, tentatively named, about literature played a significant role constructing nation, society, mass, etc. It is well known that Belinsky, a 19th century Russian literary critic, considered Russian literature should reflect Russian society that was being formed at that time. Regarding my research topic, I'm studying the comparative history of melodrama in Russian and Asian culture, where melodrama was considered and is considered to reflect the essence of social structure in the simplest form. For the researchers as Thomas Elsesser and Laura Mulvey, potential power of melodrama to criticize social structure lies precisely in the simple reflection of the social structure. Hence, my first question is as follows. The reflection theory should be always rejected. Isn't it possible that the reflection theory empowers and will empower the non-Western writer reader? My second and third questions are about Gadamer's theory of language. According to Zoran, it maintains that whatever else stories may achieve, they also create a meaningful society and make possible an ethical sharing of the common world, as opposed to the merely common physical environment. Telling a story is a communicative act through which a society establishes what it means to be human, to be a saint or a hero, honorable or happy, or to live with others. And this act constructs tacit background understandings, which to all members of a society seem natural and universal. Or to put it differently, individuals become members of a particular society if they share the same tacit background understandings. They, language speakers, become members of the same collectivity if they share these meanings, and strangers and foreigners if they do not. End quote. But for me, a contemporary culture cannot be identified with the web of meanings or the totality of significance which we share with one another. In other words, culture and language seem not to coincide in the current world situation. For example, the visual, and often in conjunction with it, the unconscious physical practices, habitus, if we use Pierre Bourdieu's term, play a significant role in contemporary culture. I think so. My second question is as follows. Does the body have a place in the intersubjective articulation of our words through language as formulated by Gadamer? And if yes, how? My third final question is related to the second and is about possible conflict between interpretations and the role of translation mediating the conflict. As I said above, culture and language seem not to coincide in the current world situation. A culture may contain many languages, not only one language, and vice versa. That is, a language may contain many cultures. In this situation, the close reading of cultural texts in the original language, if it never ends, as Jacques Derrida may say, does not necessarily lead to mutual understanding. Rather, it might lead to divided interpretations of a cultural text, lead to a conflict between opposing discourses. I think translation could mitigate and mediate the conflict between opposing discourses, although today Zoran has not mentioned translation. The final question is as follows. I'd like to ask what Gadamer thinks about the possibility of the conflict between different interpretations of culture, and what he thinks about the role of translation. That's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Daisuke. I think we will let Zoran somehow react to these questions, and then after that we will join in discussion.
Yes, thank you very much, Daisuke. All these questions are very inspiring, and we could probably start a month-long discussion on any of them. But I'll try to comprise my answers into 5 minutes. Dasha, Masha, is it too much? Yeah, 5 minutes is probably optimal. Okay, your first question was, should reflection theory be always rejected? But I think it's important to make a clear distinction between two different things, which are somehow summed up under the label reflection theory. One is a theory proper, meaning something, an intellectual construct produced by theoreticians such as Plato and Aristotle, who may or may not agree with the question that language reflects reality. That would be reflection theory proper. And the other one would be a poetical conviction by some authors that by representing the reality of their cultures and nations, they're making an intervention within that culture or that nation. These two things are not the same. They're different. And we should probably be very strict with the former, with the theoreticians who claim that language accurately represents reality, and ask that they, explain themselves. And we should be more lenient with the second group, so with the writers who claim that they are participating in the ideological and cultural battles, which they do. But they don't need to have the level of theoretical sophistication high enough to be able to understand that you are participating, but when you say that you're accurately representing reality, sorry to tell you, but you're wrong. Now, these are two, in my view, two different things. I'm not quite sure that I understand Daisuke's premise that culture and language do not coincide. I don't know in what sense that demands explanation. So I will simply have to make a guess as of the meaning of that. But as I'm in this talk, I pretended to be a phenomenologist who represents Heidegger's and Gadamer's take on this issue. So I'll remain in the role and tell you what Gadamer would have answered to your question. The being that can be understood is language. That will be the premise. So there is nothing to be understood outside of the language. It does not mean that language is all. This is not a case of an extreme linguisticality, but it means that if you want to discuss the contribution of the body to the culture, you will have to resort to language. You won't be able to describe it, to analyze it, to understand it in any other way but in the linguistic way. So in that case, there is no an outside of the language, simply because you don't have any access to something which is not linguistic in nature, at least as long as you're trying to achieve those aims we are discussing here. And as for Gadamer and conflict and translation, this was the third question. We really don't have the time for discussing the differences between Derrida's and Gadamer's positions on that. I can simply briefly say that the differences between them are much smaller than is normally assumed in manuals for undergraduate students of literature, simply because they share the same background. They're both Heidegger's children. They come from the same philosophical position. The differences between them can be relatively easily explained for non-specialists by saying that Derrida believes that there is no point where we can say this play of language and of meaning stops here. And Gadamer says, probably not theoretically, but in practical everyday life, we do it all the time. Otherwise, understanding or discussion will not be possible. And simply to make it less theoretical, I will remind those of you who know about the conflict that they had, the discussion that they had in 1981 in Paris in the German Cultural Center, when Gadamer first explained his understanding of interpretation and Derrida asked certain questions. which led towards the conclusion that understanding as such is actually impossible. Gadamer's reply started with, Monsieur Derrida asks me a question and he wants to be understood. And that's pretty much all you need to say about that. So if understanding is impossible, why are you asking me anything? That would be Gadamer's answer. His theory would say that understanding is agreement, but agreement doesn't mean the absence of conflict. It means meeting on the common ground. I understand you, and I say, yeah, I understand, but I disagree. And that disagreement is a conflict. So when we bring our respective positions closer, it doesn't mean that we have to achieve some state without any friction or any conflict. It simply means that we can understood and achieve a state in which we mostly, for the most part, understand our respective positions, disagreeing all along. Is this, I guess, is this answering the question about the conflict? I guess so. And briefly, Gadamer did write a lot about translation. It's an important aspect of his philosophy, but whatever he had to say about that has been elaborated a lot more in recent years, especially with the focus that exactly comparative literature has on untranslatables, on things which are not translatable. And there has been a lot published about that question, and this is something that we should keep in mind. But that strongly support the position that I am advocating here, that exactly those untranslatables, which you may want to call background understandings, are things that we should be focused on when we involve studying language and literature in the realm of area studies. Several years ago, when I was preparing a research project, I solicited help from a number of scholars from various languages and various disciplines. And I asked them to provide examples of mistranslation or impossibility of translating something. And I can probably embarrass myself with one example and amuse you with another. And I'll start with the other one. A colleague who studies Hindu culture told me that what we normally in English and in other West European languages translate as passive resistance. That if you want to be precise while translating that composite world, which Mahatma Gandhi created himself, you should say, politely defending your own point of view, while at the same time preserving the dignity of your opponents. Now, try to use it, please, the next time you want to say passive resistance. And the other one was, if I understood it right, but all our Japanese colleagues may help us with that if I misunderstood it, says that Japanese culture had difficulty translating the concept of atheism. So apparently there was a period when it was not possible to be an atheist in Japanese culture. That as in ancient Greek culture, Japanese culture assumes that everything is full of gods, and that position which would negate that simply does not make any sense culturally. That may or may not be true. Thank you very much. I'm not going to keep the microphone for much longer.
Okay, thank you, Zoran. Daisuke, would you like to add something to this at this point?
Yes. First of all, I very appreciate for that Zoran explained how Gadamer understands understanding. For him, what is understanding? Yes, I understood his concept of understanding. Yes, thank you. And however, it seems to me that Gadamer, in Gadamer's language theory, the dimension of how people, how to say, practice language in everyday situation, such a body dimension lacks in Gadamer's theory. So it seems to me a little bit language centrism, logocentrism, are kind of. It's my brief comment. Thank you.
Okay, I see that Zoran doesn't necessarily want to.
Oh, sorry, I didn't know. I didn't understand the time was expected.
Oh,
Yeah,
no, it's
sure.
up to you.
Yeah, sure. I'll understand very briefly. Sure, yes, of course. I mean, if your premise is the being that can be understood is language, of course you can be accused of being logocentric. But to go back to your example with the body, right? Your sub-question number 2 was, how do we put the body in that context? And I'll tell you immediately, you put the body in that context by saying the body language, don't you, right? This is the only way that you can put it. So you see, you cannot even think about communicating with your body without resorting to the linguistic paradigm. And what you actually do when you do that, you translate my gestures. For instance, this, you say, this is appreciation and agreement, right? So you're translating the body into the language, because the being that can be understood is language and nothing else. Yes, you're right. It's logocentric. Yeah. Only that I don't see anything wrong with that. I think it's a good thing. Thank you.
Yes, a human being, homoloquens, we can't help it.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we have 20 minutes, still 22 minutes, and I would like very much to continue the discussion of this paper. I have a small question and comment, but I don't want to monopolize it. So perhaps somebody else at this point would like to ask a question. Yes, David, please, I see your hand. Go ahead. And good morning. I know it's very early.
Good morning. How are you all? I enjoyed both of those presentations very much. Excuse me. I myself am working on a continuation of David Engerman's work, in which he analyzed the creation of the American Russian Area Studies Centers right after World War II by looking through the Rockefeller materials on how they also influenced the reestablishment of Slavic studies outside of America. They traveled to Europe, they were in England, they had an effect on UCL as well. They were in Germany reestablishing Slavic studies, they were in France. So this general discussion about area studies is extremely useful. Zoran's book was extremely useful for me. Thank you so much. One of the things that struck me a lot about it was that people coming from, like yourself, coming from literature and language, came up with different answers in many ways to those who were coming from social sciences, such as Mark Beisinger, who felt a little bit like an outlier in this text. But nonetheless, you all agreed that there was a real rebirth of area studies, that there were multiple functions that could be accomplished by area studies, And here, what Wendy said, I thought was really important. What is it useful for? But also, for whom is it useful? And the answers can be very multiple to that, since we have multiple consumers of our product, from students to policymakers to larger audiences, and of course, our own academic world. But beyond that, that's sort of where I'm coming from, and hopefully I'll get a chance to have you read some of my work if I can ever finish the draft of this article. But I had some questions. For Zoran in particular, I understand a linguistic approach means one thing, but my more specific question is, what is the role of linguistics itself in area studies, which is something different from talking about a linguistic approach? Should every one of our area studies units have a linguist there? Is that some kind of a core presence? And you know, I know we have linguists in the audience, so but you'll have to be careful what you say there. But you know, that's my first question. As we think about, you know, again, you know, I was thinking about the difference between the way social scientists might answer your question about what's the role of area studies and from the humanities, and linguistics. Where is that? That's somewhere in the middle between the two, maybe. And the second, I heard a lot of discussion about issues of colonialism and post-colonialism and the whole issue of East and West or North and South. Those seem to be tied up in those power issues. And your final discussion in your article about Said's Orientalism, I thought was a really good reorganizing and salvaging of Said for a next generation in a way. But the question I wanted to ask is, if we think about there being these power relations between those who study and those who are studied, between the imperial / neo-imperial world and the colonial / post-colonial world, does that field of power work equally on both sides of that divide? Because the Jameson statement seems to be saying, and the thing that I see people reacting so strongly against is that the post-colonial world cannot overcome its post-colonial predicament. Everything it writes reflects that post-colonial struggle, whereas somehow the imperial world isn't as immersed in that. And of course, Jameson would be, I guess, thinks he's coming from a place that's deeply sympathetic to the third world. And so for him, it becomes a shocker to see people so violently reject his empathy, empathy in quotes. So I'm wondering, which side is the force field stronger on one side of the colonial divide in your reading? And this is a general question for everyone. This certainly for Uyama-san as well. And I guess the final question I would ask is, thinking again about those Rockefeller case officers going out, all Americans, everyone, going out there and establishing area studies in America, and then crossing not only one ocean, but both oceans, because they establish area studies in Japan, as well as this reestablishing it in Europe. Is it different? Can one have area studies of one's own culture, or is that absolutely not allowable? Does it have to be an other for it to be area studies? So that would be my third question, and maybe I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, David, very much. Thank you for the compliments to start with. I'm really surprised with the approval that this small book met since it was published, and I'm not unhappy about that.
Let me interrupt and say, Wendy's also in here as well with a very substantive article, very useful article, the one in which David Engerman is mentioned. So thank you, Wendy.
Right. And briefly to address all three questions that you had, area studies historically started with linguists, proper linguists. Not only that the first out of 4 positions at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, 3 were taken by linguists when it was established. But we can go even further. We can take a look at the establishment of the proper Orientalist departments in German academia in the early 19th century. These people were all linguists. Their job was to compile dictionaries. So this is what tells you where the basic work of area studies still resides. Without knowing the language, there are no area studies. And if you say, we all agree that linguists, professional linguists or disciplinary linguists are disappearing from area studies, that this is considered not to be the essential or the core subject of area studies. I couldn't disagree more with that. I think that linguists are still at the very fundament of everything we do, and I think that every area studies department or school should have at least one linguist, simply because most people from other disciplines are not familiar with the changes that have happened within the field of linguistics in the last 30 years. This is not the discipline that they imagined. This is not the early 19th century German scholars who compiled dictionaries. They do amazing things which are very, very close to what we do in other disciplines. So yes, I would be for that. If SSEES is listening, I would really I would want to candidate one post of the post that we have available for a linguist at SSEES. I think that it's your second question demands a very, very long answer, and I don't think we have the time for that. But I will simply point to the fact that whenever you go, whichever Arabic study department in the US you go to these days, 80% of people teaching there will be Arabs, wouldn't they? Yeah, take a look at SSEES. Look how many East Europeans teach at SSEES. This has changed as well. And whenever we make those sharp divisions between East and West, we should keep in mind that the position of the West here is taken by me and Masha, you know, Easterners, right? So that should also introduce a caveat in all our discussions of power. Power is never, if you really want to be a proper Foucauldian, you would say power is not a one-way street. Power circulates. Power is everywhere, and you know it's never in one hands only. It changes hands. So enough of that. That should be probably a topic for a new conference. Maybe we should think about having this as a topic that we discuss, and then we will see how many unexpected angles we can take in that. Your third question was, can we always only study another's culture? This is what anthropologists would say. Some of them rarely study their own cultures, and I read several quite successful books about one's own culture. But what is given that I cast myself in the position of a phenomenologist today, I don't know why is this so, because normally I wouldn't be a phenomenologist 24 hours a day. What they would say, what Gadamer would say from that position is that it is never one or another, that in order to achieve any sort of understanding, you sort of go halfway through. You become another in order to understand another's position, and the other way around. So every sort of understanding always assumes stepping out of one's own position. Remaining in one's own position is not understanding anything. if this can be a beginning of an answer, I would be really happy with that.
That sounds well spoken by a comparativist. And of course, if you have an international faculty such as UCL, well, then you could invite them all and you could have British studies and they would be studying it from the point of view of the other, even if they were studying it on British money in Britain.
True.
Right. Okay. No, I was wondering whether you can really call something area studies and have it be a study of the same place where you are and you were brought up.
Yeah. I mean, I read by a Japanese colleague in an article about film. I read a very instructive sentence. He says, what you call European studies is actually area studies. This is what comparative literature,
Right.
sorry.
Absolutely.
What you call comparative literature is actually European studies. This is what you do. Don't be fooled about your own position in academia. You may not be aware of that, but this is exactly what you're doing.
He must have read his Said.
Yeah,
Right.
Certainly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Actually, I hope, David, that maybe in the next round, you will take a more active part and give a paper on your very interesting project you're working on now, but also on what you have already done in terms of Rockefeller's influence on the establishment of the Slavic-Eurasian Research Center. I think that would be a perfect sort of complement to the papers we heard today.
Thank you, Maria. I've kind of finished reading the Rockefeller files, and now I'm reading the Columbia University files. I'm in New York now because they worked largely through that, what was then called the Russia Institute, in bringing in people from all around the world to show them the American way in area studies. So that's kind of the last piece of my research, and then I hope to finish a paper, and looking forward to comments on it.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I have a very sort of quick comment, rather a question to Zoran, perhaps in the time remaining. Perhaps we can take a couple more questions. Well, obviously, language is very central to your argument and in general. But I'm always concerned, maybe because I have studied lately mostly sort of diaspora. Where would you place bilingual individuals, bicultural individuals, writers and artists who maybe switch languages, switch from their native language to adopted tongue? And this practice, obviously, globally is only increasing lately. So don't such practices erode those webs of meaning that you are talking about? Or maybe they change the perspective on these webs of meanings? I'm not sure, but perhaps this is maybe related to what Daisuke meant to say when he said that culture and language do not always coincide, because many hybrid individuals and artists, they sort of manage to infuse text maybe with elements of the other language, right? And vice versa. And because they're located in this ultimate in-between space, which culture are they in conversation with, and which webs of meanings do they plug into?
Yeah, exactly. But you know, when Gadamer says language, he means our human, universal human ability to communicate in whatever we call a natural language. It does not necessarily refer to a specific national language, such as English or Russian. So to them as well, but more to the linguisticality of our human existence, right? So it's not in contradiction with what you described as a transnational literature written by Mexicans in the US in English or Turks in Germany. I'm very fond of those works because they always have at least those two languages that I understand sort of to a certain extent. It's always that German written by Turks or by Serbo-Croats as well is always slanted. It's never really German. But what you can see there is a contamination of those two worlds, two webs of meanings. This is why it is interesting, and this is why we call it transnational. It's not a web of meaning. It's not the German world, but the German world understood as a web of meaning in which another web of meaning is nested. And the friction between them is what makes those things interesting. I don't see why would this paradigm be undermined by the existence of such transnational authors. On the contrary, I see them as a confirmation that this is what we should be doing. So if you want to discuss, for instance, within area studies, it'll be completely legitimate to discuss the topic of immigrants in Germany, for instance. If you want to tackle their world, one of the ways, and I would say one of the most fruitful ways, would be exactly this one, to approach them from the linguistic point of view. From linguistic point of view, now I'm again probably misleading you. From the language point of view, you would probably want to see how the web of meaning that they brought with themselves simply by being raised in a particular language. To come to the world is to come to a language. This is what acquiring a world means. And once acquired that world, they have to reacquire a new one. And this is where you can see the differences between those two worlds easily. And this is where they become most obvious.
This is when you look at them from the perspective of the host culture, but they belong to more than one, and perhaps to more than one area studies, right?
Yeah, exactly. You would call it host culture only conventionally, because if you want to be precise, you would have to explain why is one of them a host country, and who is a host and who is a guest. They could simply claim that they have that both ends are hosts, which would then turn out to that as a result, you can come up with the conclusion that guests are everywhere, that no one is actually a host anywhere. That'll be rather Parisian perspective, which you may be sensitive to.
But this comes back to the for whom question. People of mixed ancestry, they are going to have all kinds of truly deep insights about the two cultures they represent, assuming they've been raised in both cultures, which is possible. You could just have the language on one side, but you really could have both cultures deeply. And then those people are going to have a huge advantage for doing this type of work that requires a deep, insightful knowledge of otherness. They are already head and shoulders ahead of everyone else. But if what you're talking about is just deep understanding of one culture, then departments that are 80% Arabs, well, that's the future, because if you're born with that sort of knowledge, you have such a huge head start that someone coming from starting Arabic at age 18 or has almost no chance of catching you up just in volume of completing your reading.
True.
But finally, if you're a government and you need to have experts and you need to make sure they're reliable, then neither of those categories is acceptable. You need something else. You need something else altogether.
Well, David, Foreign Office has its own research unit. They don't really care much about the views taken at School of Slavonic and East European Studies.
Right, but they want your students. You need to train them. They want you to train people that they can then take. Maybe it's at some point that was probably truer than it is now. But when the Russian Institute gets started at Columbia, they trained the first 300 experts that go on to those American embassies, the CIA, the state, first 300 out the door at Columbia. They all populate those places, and there's no Russian emigres among them.
Sure.
Yeah. So sorry, that's a for whom type issue.
Yeah.
Well, I have a practical question to Dash. Dash, does our link expire in a couple of minutes, or if we run over it's not a big deal.
I don't think it does.
It does. Well, because clearly, you know, there's a lot to be said, and I understand that we've been together for 3 hours, but those of you who can stay for a few extra minutes, I think, let's try to use this link. If somehow we are cut off, then we will continue our discussion by other means and in other formats, right? Clearly, it feels already that we need to continue probably along the same lines, rethinking area studies from different perspectives, because even today's just 2 papers, 2 presentations, and the kind of feedback it has provoked clearly indicates that there's a lot more to say. So perhaps when we start planning the next research seminar, maybe in about 6 months' time, maybe early summer, something like this, we will try to make a sequel to this one, and then we'll see where we go from there. Again, coming back to this question of sort of bilinguals and biculturals, I understand that they are a great asset when you study the area, the so-called host country, the country where they are working from now, right? And where they're introducing their additional insight and anthropological experience that they bring with them. But I personally deal with a situation when with the situation of the reception of diaspora art and diaspora literature back in Russia. And they are framed in a completely different way. Usually precisely the transnational aspects of their experience and of their writings are underemphasized, ignored, sometimes deliberately, and they are sort of put back into the rather nationalist framework. And they're traced back to the classical Russian literature, to some Russian writing, to some Russian master narratives and discourses. And this is precisely the problem, because in each area, if you wish, they are appropriated as their own. Meanwhile, probably they belong to more than one. You know, I'm just curious, what is the place of diaspora studies in general within area studies? Of course, there is a whole field that's called diaspora studies. But for example, somebody like me, who is a comparativist, but also works on diaspora, and I sort of belong to the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, but it's broader than that. And also my material, the authors, the writings, where would they belong? And I wonder, and how should we deal with them structurally and methodologically if we if we adopt area studies as our major model? This is sort of my question that's bothering me also in a very personal way, because each time I give a talk, a presentation, a lecture in Russia, I get a completely different reaction compared to when I'm presenting the same material, well, outside of Russia. I don't want to say in the West, but sort of outside of Russia. So I don't know, Zoran, if you have any insight in that.
Yeah, I have, but before I try to answer, for the benefit of everybody else, I have to say that right now Masha is dealing with Russian authors in the Middle East, in Israel. Am I right? And Lebanon.
Yes, well,
yes.
Mostly sort of Israel and the Middle East. And precisely this is another area, geographical, political, geopolitical, and we have very complex relationship between some Russian writers who may also be writing in Hebrew, right? Yeah. Using different social and cultural codes when they address local audience, Israeli, let's say, or Jewish, and when they are going back and sort of plugging themselves into the Russian market and contemporary discourses. See, so exactly, I feel that I'm personally torn between completely different area studies.
Yeah, but this is one of the meanings of the expression area studies without borders, if I understood it right. So you're dealing with 2 areas, with the Middle East and with Russia, and instead of sticking that should be somehow relegated to the dustbin, this idea that we deal only with one area, we are interested only in the questions which clearly belong to our area, and we don't care about anything else. on the contrary, that'll be a new approach. That'll be critical area studies at its best, you know, dealing with those two areas, connecting them and discussing this question across the border between two areas at the same time.
In fact, more than just two, because they conversation also with diaspora authors from Russia, for example, or from the post-Soviet, who may be elsewhere in the world, right? So, okay, well, I don't want to really monopolize this. Maybe we'll take a question or two before we wrap it up. I understand that people may have other things to do, and in Japan, it's getting pretty late. So, nonetheless, it's an exciting discussion and very thought-provoking. So please, if somebody wants to make a comment, ask a question, add something to what has been said, you're most welcome.
I would like to hear opinions of historians about text, about literary text.
Is this to me? Is this a question for me?
No.
Oh, sorry.
Historians, yes, it would be interesting to have also kind of dialogue between our disciplines and reactions to how we see the same problem from a more sort of cultural, textual point of view rather than historical point of view. I thought personally there were lots of parallels between the two presentations today. Yoko, please. Hi. Maybe you should unmute.
Hi.
Okay, you're fine. We hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I'm not a specialist on literature, so I might be totally wrong. But from the standpoint of a historian on the Russian Empire, I'd like to ask some question to Zoran. As far as I understand, you are arguing that a group of works which might be called literature, written in a language, represent a national culture. Is that right? And if so, it seems to me that you are saying that a language group creates a nation. And the way of thinking reminds me of an assumption that I often encounter in the historical materials in the Tsarist era, that if you have developed literature, then you have an independent nation. But if not, then you are the object of assimilation. That's a kind of a logic of empire. But it seems to me that the people in the empire lived in a more complex world. For example, does the novel which Franz Kafka wrote in Prague in Germany represents German culture or what? Probably my question is related to Maria's question, but in a historical sense. Or did Czech people who talk in Germany in daily life have no independent culture? Or does Belarusians who usually talk in Russian have no culture, no national culture? My questions might be quite naive, but I would be grateful if you give me your opinions on that matter. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm very familiar, as everybody else, with the view that you just explicated, but I was very careful never to come close to it. So I'm not advocating it. I never claimed anything like that. And yes, my position can be confronted with that older traditional and maybe not historically outdated. It can be a comparative position taken by many nationalists worldwide, but there is nothing in what I said that would indicate that I support that position. Well, if you want to be if you press me more on that and you want me to be more specific, I would say that in that respect, as in all other respects, whenever we approach a question academically, we have to look at the mainstream, allowing for exceptions and borderline cases, which would mean that, yes, I would say that the way to study a culture leads through a language. But it does not mean that possessing a language means that you have to have a nation state. So if you want to, to put it several registers down, that'll probably mean that, but I never advocated anything like that. I simply say the way to studying a culture leads through that culture's language. And of course, there are always borderline cases. There are transnational speakers, not only transnational writers. There is always Kafka, yes. But, the existence of Kafka does not mean that you shouldn't study German culture through German language, or Czech culture through Czech language. Does it make any sense as an answer?
Yeah, for now. So, but it's important point for thinking about empire. And I'm studying the native language education in the empire. So I have to think that problem more. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
It's very insightful. Yeah.
All right. I think if there is any one final question or comment, we can afford it. If not, I think that my impression is that it's been a very fruitful, interesting, inspiring discussion. I was first wondering whether we need the full 3 hours, maybe only 2. And I realized that, of course, that we could still go on and continue. And in fact, in process, come up with new ideas. So unfortunately, we don't have much time to really wrap it up and pull it together. And perhaps it's a bit premature even. What it seems to me, and maybe Daisuke will have a different opinion, is that we probably need to continue this discussion, have at least one more session on the area studies. And it's not necessarily, we won't necessarily say the same thing, Slavic area studies, but something with area studies, maybe area studies without borders. That's a wonderful, wonderful metaphor. And we'll see to what extent it actually holds. We certainly need some kind of channel where we could perhaps communicate and post our feedback in the meantime. So we need to think about sort of formalizing our relationship and making our outputs and accumulated material available, accessible, so we can continue this discussion. So we'll see what is possible from the technical point of view and institutional point of view. And I would like to thank everyone who joined today. Please write to us, to me, to Daisuke, to any presenters, and continue this discussion as much as possible. So before I say goodbye, Daisuke, I'd like for you to maybe say some final words as well. And next time, perhaps you will be mostly moderating. And maybe I'll give a paper, I don't know, but certainly I've been inspired to think a little bit about my own research from this point of view.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you all for wonderful presentations and discussions. As Maria has said, I also hope we can continue our cooperation in a kind of this seminar or publication. Today, yes, we have found many common topics and interests, as well as differences. So this is, I think this is a good reason for us to continue our discussion. So again, I would like to thank everyone for your participation and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for organizing this.
Thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon and a nice evening, and we'll be in touch soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.